Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepytime Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we go any further, I would just like to have a chat to all you listeners. This is for everybody, although it's mostly aimed at people who've been with me for a while and make regular use of Sleepytime Tales to help them or their loved ones get a good night's sleep. I'd like to ask that if you are enjoying the show and you're finding it useful, and if you have the means to provide some support, please consider helping me to grow the show by supporting me on Patreon. My basic costs are covered at the moment, which is very nice, thanks to those people who are signed up and supporting me every month. And I'd like to do, I am going to do a little bit of a equipment upgrade fairly soon. And I'd like to go a little bit further. And really, in the long term, I really would love to do this show full time. I find doing Sleepytime Tales more satisfying than I actually would have even imagined. And I'd like to do more episodes, spend some more time doing more creative work. And I've got ideas for like a whole integrated system of helping people, of tools to help people sleep, and I'd like the time to do that, and to do that I would need to be doing this full time. So if you can provide some support and help me to get there one day, that would be fantastic. I have Patreon levels from $1 and $5. I'm not going to go into too many of the details. I recommend you go and take a look. But there are benefits there that even if you can only spare $1 a month, you get something out of it. And that's besides the knowledge that you're helping me to grow the show and reach people and help improve people's lives. I hear back from people every now and then who are really helped by the show, and it's a very cool feeling. It's a bit of a strange idea when I hit on it. Not unique, but it seemed really odd to try to do a podcast that helps people sleep, and the fact that there are people out there that I'm helping is very satisfying, and I'd like to help more. So as I say, I'm not going to go into too many of the benefits of the specifics of the Patreon. Go take a look at patreon.com/sleepytimetales and have a look. But the things I do want to mention is I've got 2 short-term bonuses that I'm doing at the moment. I was doing it up to the end of November, but I'm extending it up to the end of December. Anyone who signs up at the $5 level will get a postcard in the mail from me. Just need your postal address when you join, and I'll send you something fun and touristy. And I would like to do a bonus video episode for patrons. So if I get up to $50 I was also saying by the end of November, but I'm going to extend that to the end of December. If I get up to $50 a month by the end of December, I'll do a bonus video episode for patrons, and that the audio from that will be released for everybody later on as a bonus episode in the following month. If you can't contribute directly financially to the running of the show, that is perfectly fine and understandable. Times are hard out there, I understand. But there are other little things you can do to help as well. You can sign up on my Audible trial at audible.com/sleepytime to get a free audiobook to keep, as well as a 30-day free trial of the Audible service. And that gives me a nice handy little kickback. And if you sign up there using that link, please let me know so that I can give you a bit of a shout out. I'd like to support people who support me. Then also up on Radio Public, I've got catnap bonus episodes. So if you listen on the Radio Public app on your iPhone or Android phone, you can only get those there, or you can get those at the $1 level at Patreon. So also worth taking a look there. Radio Public has some advertising, and I get a little bit of a kickback for regular listens. And it's also a really cool app. It's very nice for discoverability. If you listen to something it makes recommendations for others that are quite effective and very, very good. And last but not least, I would like to, as usual, call out the music for the show. The music is Un Desert by Kumiku. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive. I've linked their website and their Patreon in the show notes because they've got some very cool stuff released under various names that I recommend you check out. And with that, we are back to the show. Thank you very much. So what exactly is Sleepytime Tales? What is it for? It seems a bit of a strange idea, doesn't it? It's a podcast that you listen to and you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning and your emotions in turmoil with anxieties of your life? Is the 21st century just creating stress for you? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find that you can't quite doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Now, I'm someone who has struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. My parents had sleepless nights with me for years, and even once I got old enough not to bother them anymore, I always used to struggle. It was fairly recently, in the last couple of years, that I discovered the tendency for droning male voices to act almost like a sedative. I was lying in bed at night, listening to podcasts, and I'd find myself fast asleep as though I'd been tranquilized. And it took me a while to realize that there were some podcasts out there specifically intended for people to fall asleep to. I tried a few and they worked quite well for me, but when I recommended them to other people, not everybody enjoyed the various narrators' voices or the formats. So I thought, I've got a boring, droning male voice, and I will come up with something interesting and see if I can make it work. Now, every episode starts with this long intro. It usually goes on about 15 or so minutes, so be warned about that if this is your first time here. If you don't like it, there's a timestamp in the show notes and you can skip straight to the story. But it's here for a reason. My main thing is I want to introduce myself to the listeners and introduce the show and sort of explain the concepts and what the show is for, so that to help people decide whether or not it is for them. And it also has a second purpose, that for longer time listeners, they use this as a chance to basically sort of help them prepare to sleep. Insomnia is a habit, and creating a more restful life and getting over insomnia is also about creating habits. So this whole long intro is intended for the people who've been here a while to sort of start preparing themselves. Turn your lights out, make sure your room is a good, comfortable temperature. Make sure your teeth are brushed, have a little bit of water so that you don't wake up thirsty in the middle of the night, and not too much so that you don't wake up for other reasons. And work together to create the space that we are trying to create, this nest or cave or cabin, whatever it is you want to think of it as, this room in this environment that's friendly to your sleep. Now, as far as I know, there are a couple of different ways to engage with this show. If there are others and I haven't thought about them, I don't know if you folks can hear the birds there in the background. Those are hadedas. And I'm going to leave this in because I think it's like quite a good scene setting if it is there. Oh, where was I? Oh, the methods of engaging with the show is basically, as far as I know, there are two ways to listen to it. When I listen to a sleep podcast, what I go for is I need something that I can listen to that has a sort of point and a storyline, but it's not so gripping that I just cannot let go and fall asleep. I just have to hear what happens next. So that's why I designed these stories as, well, the stories that I write tonight is a different one, to be interesting ideas that are executed boringly, so that It's like, oh, hey, that sounds cool. Let me give that a listen. And halfway through, you're asleep because ultimately it's not as interesting as it sounds. The other way is what some people need is just a little bit of background noise. For them, a droning baritone is similar to the sound of sea or rain to other people. Now, I mentioned tonight's story. I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm doing a reading of The Star by H.G. Wells. Usually do original stuff or reviews or mythology interpretations. But I just wanted to try something a little bit different tonight and see how it works for the listeners. If you got any feedback, let me know on the social media or the email address, contact@sleepytimetales.net, and let me know how it goes for you. In concept, it's similar to the catnap bonus episodes that go out on Radio Public and to Patreon, except longer, because those are usually about 10 or 15 minutes, and this one should go on for a while. But now, obviously, whatever the story is, I'm hoping that you're asleep by the end of it, whether it's something I'm reading to you or something I've written for you. Ultimately, the point is I'm here to keep you company and help you to get to sleep. But what is very important is that you don't try to force it. You can't force sleep. I'm sure a lot of us have tried that and it hasn't worked out very well. You need to just keep a light mental grip on my voice and on the story, and when sleep comes for you, don't fight. You can't fight it. And also, it's possible that one episode's not long enough. I've got listeners I know who listen to a couple a night to get them through it, and because that's what I do. I queue up a whole bunch of episodes of the sleep podcast that I listen to, and I let them run all night. Whatever you do, though, it's important that you try to relax. If you're new to the show or to sleep podcasts and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, it may take a few days for this to work for you. Allow 2 or 3 nights before you come to judgment, and if my show doesn't work for you, there's others out there that are very, very good and may be effective. And also remember, whatever happens, we're trying to create habits here and overcome other habits, so it's possible that it's just going to be patience. Take your time to develop this new good habit. When I leave the podcast running, I often find I wake up at 3 a.m. and they're still going, and just let the voices waft me back to sleep. That waking up at 3 a.m. can be one of the worst, because you almost don't even know if you're awake, and it's quite hard to deal with, because the more awake you become, the more awake you are. But me, I just pop my earbuds back in, and whoop, there I go, back again. Sometimes even like 30 to 60 minutes before my alarm goes off, I wake up. What I do then is I do the same. I just carry on listening to my podcasts, and that 30 minutes often is just the best part of my night. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's something about allowing yourself just perfect relaxation at 30 minutes left on your clock. That's just is very deeply satisfying. And so you've got the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way. Or, I don't know, is it small? People don't sleep very well these days, and while I'm not going to say I'm changing lives, I think I am helping people to face tomorrow, to get some rest and help them cope. It's very important, and I want to emphasize this, that I want to focus on kindness with this show. I want to be kind to you. I want to help you sleep. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. And what is very important is I need you to be kind to yourself. It's possible that this show won't work for you tonight or tomorrow night. It might take a few nights. It might work for you for weeks, and suddenly one night you're just not getting any sleep. And whatever happens, don't beat yourself up. Don't rebuke yourself. Don't get upset that you can't sleep, because that's not going to help. Just lie down and listen to whatever nonsense I'm prattling, and you can come back tomorrow. It's important not to get frustrated, because frustration is one of the enemies of a good night's sleep. This podcast is intended to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact that you can't sleep, and let my voice wash over you and under you. Take another breath, and imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep and a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself, and try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep can feel something like an enemy, but it is not your enemy. It is a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life, and the supposed progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. From Tales of Space and Time by H.G. Wells. The Star. It was on the first day of the new year that the announcement was made, almost simultaneously from 3 observatories, that the motion of the planet Neptune, the outermost of all the planets that wheel about the sun, had become very erratic. Ogilvy had already called attention to suspected retardation in its velocity in December. Such a piece of news was scarcely calculated to interest a world the greater portion of whose inhabitants were unaware of the existence of the planet Neptune. Nor outside the astronomical profession did the subsequent discovery of a faint remote speck of a light in the region of the perturbed planet cause any very great excitement. Scientific people, however, found the intelligence remarkable enough, even before it became known that the new body was rapidly growing larger and brighter, that its motion was quite different from the orderly progress of the planets, and that the deflection of Neptune and its satellite was becoming now of an unprecedented kind. Few people without a training in science can realize the huge isolation of the solar system. The sun, with its specks of planets, its dust of planetoids, and its impalpable comets, swims in a vacant immensity that almost defeats the imagination. Beyond the orbit of Neptune there is space, vacant so far as human observation is penetrated, without warmth or light or sound, blank emptiness, for 20 million times a million miles. That is the smallest estimate of the distance to be traversed before the very, very nearest of the stars is attained. And saving a few comets more insubstantial than the thinnest flame, no matter had ever to human knowledge crossed this gulf of space. Until early in the 20th century, the strange wanderer appeared. A vast mass of matter it was, bulky, heavy, rushing without warning out of the black mystery of the sky into the radiance of the sun. By the second day it was clearly visible to any decent instrument, as a speck with a barely sensible diameter, in the constellation Leo near Regulus. In a little while an opera glass could attain it. On the 3rd day of the new year, the newspaper readers of 2 hemispheres were made aware for the first time of the real importance of this unusual apparition in the heavens. A planetary collision, one London paper headed the news, and proclaimed Duchesne's opinion that this strange new planet would probably collide with Neptune. The leader writers enlarged upon the topic, so that in most of the capitals of the world, on January 3rd, there was an expectation, however vague, of some imminent phenomenon in the sky. And as the night followed the sunset around the globe, thousands of men turned their eyes skyward to see the old familiar stars just as they had always been. Until it was dawn in London, and Pollux setting, and the stars overhead grown pale. The winter's dawn it was, a sickly faltering accumulation of daylight, and the lights of gas and candles shone yellow in the windows to show where people were astir. But the yawning policeman saw the thing. The busy crowds in the market stopped to gape. Workmen going to their work betimes, milkmen, the drivers of news carts, dissipation going home jaded and pale, homeless wanderers, sentinels on their beat, and in the country, labourers trudging afield, poachers slinking home. All over the dusty, quickening country it could be seen. And out at sea by seamen watching for the day, a great white star comes suddenly into the westward sky. Brighter it was than any star in our skies, brighter than the evening star at its brightest. It still glowed out white and large, no mere twinkling spot of light, but a small, round, clear, shining disk, an hour after the day had come. And where science has not reached, men stared and feared, telling one another of the wars and pestilences that are foreshadowed by these fiery signs in the heavens. Sturdy Boers, dusky Hottentots, Gold Coast Negroes, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, stood in the warmth of the sunrise, watching the setting of this strange new star. And in 100 observatories there had been suppressed excitement, rising almost to shouting pitch, as the two remote bodies had rushed together and are hurrying to and fro, to gather photographic apparatus and spectroscope, and this appliance and that, to record this novel, astonishing sight, the destruction of a world. For it was a world, a sister planet of our Earth, far greater than our Earth indeed, that had so suddenly flashed into flaming death. Neptune it was, had been struck, fairly and squarely, by the strange planet from outer space, and the heat of the concussion had incontinently turned two solid globes into one vast mass of incandescence. Round the world that day, 2 hours before the dawn, went the pallid great white star, fading only as it sank westward, and the sun mounted above it. Everywhere men marvelled at it, but of all those who saw it, none could have marvelled more than those sailors, habitual watchers of the stars who, far away at sea, had heard nothing of its advent, and saw it now rise like a pygmy moon and climb zenithward and hang overhead and sink westward with the passing of the night. And when next it rose over Europe, everywhere were crowds of watchers on hilly slopes, on house roofs, in open spaces, staring eastward for the rising of the great new star. It rose with a white glow in front of it, like the glare of a white fire, and those who had seen it come into existence the night before cried out at the sight of it. It is larger, they cried. It is brighter. And indeed the moon, a quarter full and sinking in the west, was in its apparent size beyond comparison, but scarcely in all its breadth had it as much brightness now as the little circle of the strange new star. It is brighter, cried the people, clustering in the streets. But the dim observatories, the watchers held their breath and peered at one another. It is nearer, they said. Nearer. And voice after voice repeated, it is nearer. And the clicking telegraph took that up, and it trembled along telephone wires. And in 1,000 cities, grimy compositors fingered the type. It is nearer. Men writing in offices, struck with a strange realization, flung down their pens. Men talking in 1,000 places suddenly came upon a grotesque possibility in those words. It is nearer. It hurried along awakening streets and was shouted down the frost-stilled ways of quiet villages. Men who had read these things from the throbbing tape stood in yellow-lit doorways, shouting the news to the passers-by. It is nearer. Pretty women, flushed and glittering, heard the news told jestingly between the dancers, and feigned an intelligent interest they did not feel. Nearer indeed. How curious. How very, very clever people must be to find things out like that. Lonely tramps faring through the wintry night murmured those words to comfort themselves, looking skyward. It has need to be nearer, for the night is cold as charity. Doesn't seem much warmth from it if it is nearer, all the same. What is a new star to me? Cried the weeping woman, kneeling beside her dead. The schoolboy, rising early for his examination work, puzzled it out for himself. With the great white star shining broad and bright through the frost flowers of his window. Centrifugal, centripetal, he said with his chin on his fist. Stop a planet in its flight, rob it of its centrifugal force, what then? Centripetal has it, and down it falls into the sun. And this? Do we come in the way, I wonder? The light of that day went the way of its brethren, and with the later watches of the frosty darkness rose the strange star again. And it was now so bright that the waxing moon seemed but a pale yellow ghost of itself, hanging huge in the sunset. In a South African city, a great man had married, and the streets were alight to welcome his return with his bride. Even the skies have illuminated, said the great flatterer. Under Capricorn, two lovers, daring the wild beasts and evil spirits, for love of one another, crouched together in a canebrake where the fireflies hovered. That is our star, they whispered, and felt strangely comforted by the sweet brilliance of its light. The master mathematician sat in his private room and pushed the papers from him. His calculations were already finished. In a small white phial there still remained a little of the drug that had kept him awake and active for 4 long nights. Each day, serene, explicit, patient as ever, he had given his lecture to his students, and they had come back at once to this momentous calculation. His face was grave, a little drawn and hectic from his drugged activity. For some time he seemed lost in thought. Then he went to the window, and the blind went up with a click. Halfway up the sky, over the clustering roofs, chimneys, and steeples of the city, hung the star. He looked at it as one might look into the eyes of a brave enemy. "You may kill me," he said after a silence, "but I can hold you, and all the universe for that matter, in the grip of this little brain. I would not change, even now." He looked at the little phial. "There will be no need of sleep again," he said. The next day at noon, punctual to the minute, he entered his lecture theatre, put his hat on the end of the table as his habit was, and carefully selected a large piece of chalk. It was a joke among his students that he could not lecture without that piece of chalk to fumble in his fingers, and once he had been stricken to impotence by then hiding his supply. He came and looked under his grey eyebrows at the rising tiers of fresh young faces, and spoke with his accustomed studied commonness of phrasing. "Circumstances have arisen, circumstances beyond my control," he said, and paused, "which will debar me from completing the course I had designed. It would seem, gentlemen, that if I may put this thing clearly and briefly, that man has lived in vain." The students glanced at one another. Had they heard aright? They had. Raised eyebrows and grinning lips there were, but 1 or 2 faces remained intent upon his calm, grey-fringed face. "It will be interesting," he was saying, "to devote this morning to an exposition, so far as I can make it clear to you, of the calculations that have led me to this conclusion. Let us assume—" He turned towards the blackboard, meditating a diagram in the way that was usual to him. "What was that about lived in vain?" whispered one student to another. "Listen," said the other, nodding towards the lecturer, and presently they began to understand. That night the star rose later, for its proper eastward motion had carried it some way across Leo towards Virgo, and its brightness was so great that the sky became a luminous blue as it rose, and every star was hidden in its turn, save only Jupiter near the zenith, Capella, Aldebaran, Sirius, and the pointers of the Bear. It was very white and beautiful. In many parts of the world that night a pallid halo encircled about it. It was perceptibly larger. In the clear refractive sky of the tropics it seemed as if it was nearly a quarter the size of the moon. The frost was still on the ground in England, but the world was as brightly lit as if it were midsummer moonlight. One could see to read quite ordinary print by that cold, clear light, and in the cities the lamps burned yellow and wan. And everywhere the world was awake that night, and throughout Christendom a sombre murmuring hung in the keen air of the countryside, like the belling of bees in the heather, and this murmurous tumult grew to a clangor in the cities. It was the tolling of bells in a million belfries, towers, and steeples, summoning the people to sleep no more, to sin no more, but to gather in their churches and pray. And overhead, growing larger and brighter as the earth rolled on its way and the night passed, rose the dazzling star. And the streets and houses were alight in all the cities. The shipyards glared, and whatever roads led to high country were lit and crowded all night long. And in all the seas about the civilized lands, ships with throbbing engines and ships with bellying sails, crowded with men and living creatures, was standing out to ocean in the north. Already the warning of the master mathematician had been telegraphed all over the world and translated into 100 tongues. The new planet and Neptune, locked in a fiery embrace, were whirling headlong, ever faster and faster towards the sun. Already every second this blazing mass flew 100 miles, and every second its terrific velocity increased, and as it flew now, indeed, it must pass 100 million miles wide of Earth and scarcely affect it. But near its destined path, as yet only slightly perturbed, spun the mighty planet Jupiter and his moons, sweeping splendidly around the sun. Every moment now the attraction between the fiery star and the greatest of the planets grew stronger, and the result of that attraction? Inevitably Jupiter would be deflected from its orbit into an elliptical path, and the burning star, swung by its attraction wide of its sunward rush, would describe a curved path, and perhaps collide with, certainly pass very close to, our Earth. Earthquakes, volcanic outbreaks, cyclones, sea waves, floods, and a steady rise in temperature to I know not what limit. So prophesied the master mathematician. And overhead, to carry out his words, lonely and cold and livid, blazed the star of the coming doom. To many who stared at it that night until their eyes ached, it seemed that it was visibly approaching. And that night, too, the weather changed, and the frost that had gripped all Central Europe and France and England softened towards a thaw. But you must not imagine, because I have spoken of people praying through the night, and people going aboard ships, and people fleeing towards the mountainous country, that the whole world was already in a terror because of the star. As a matter of fact, use and want still ruled the world, and save for the talk of idle moments and the splendor of the night, 9 human beings out of 10 were still busy at their common occupations. In all the cities, the shops, save one here and there, opened and closed at their proper hours. The doctor and the undertaker plied their trades, and workers gathered in their factories. Soldiers drilled, scholars studied, lovers sought one another. Thieves lurked and fled. Politicians planned their schemes. The presses of the newspapers roared through the nights, and many a priest of this church and that would not open his holy building to further what he considered a foolish panic. The newspapers insisted on the lesson of the year 1000, for then too people had anticipated the end. The star was no star, mere gas, a comet, and were it a star, it could not possibly strike the earth. There was no precedent for such a thing. Common sense was sturdy everywhere, scornful, jesting, little inclined to persecute the obdurate faithful. That night, at 7:15 by Greenwich time, the star would be at its nearest to Jupiter. Then the world would see the turn things would take. The master mathematician's grim warnings were treated by many as so much mere elaborate self-advertisement. Common sense at last, a little heated by argument, signified its unalterable convictions by going to bed. So too barbarism and savagery, already tired of the novelty, went about their nightly business. And save for a howling dog here and there, the beast world left the star unheeded. And yet, when at last the watchers in the European states saw the star rise, an hour later it is true, but no larger than it had been the night before, there was still plenty awake to laugh at the master mathematician, to take the danger as if it had passed. But hereafter the laughter ceased. The star grew. It grew with a terrible steadiness, hour after hour, a little larger each hour, a little nearer the midnight zenith, and brighter until it curved night into a second day. Had it come straight to the earth instead of in a curved path, had it lost no velocity to Jupiter, it may have leapt the intervening gulf in a day, but as it was, it took 5 days altogether to come by our planet. The next night it had become a third the size of the moon before it set to English eyes, and the thaw was assured. It rose over America near the size of the moon, but blinding white to look at, and hot, and a breath of hot wind blew now with its rising and gathering strength. And in Virginia and Brazil and down the St. Lawrence Valley it shone intermittently through the driving reek of thunderclouds, flickering violet lightning and hail unprecedented. In Manitoba was a thaw and devastating floods, and upon all the mountains of the earth the snow and ice began to melt that night, and all the rivers coming out of the high country flowed thick and turbid, and soon in their upper reaches, with swirling trees and the bodies of beasts and men. They rose steadily in the ghostly brilliance, and came trickling over their banks at last, behind the flying population of their valleys. And along the coast of Argentina and up the South Atlantic, tides were higher than they had ever been in the memory of man, and the storms drove the waters in many cases scores of miles inland, drowning whole cities, and so great grew the heat during the night that the rising of the sun was like the coming of a shadow. The earthquakes began and grew until all down America from the Arctic Circle to Cape Horn, hillsides were sliding, fissures were opening, and houses and walls crumbling to destruction. The whole side of Cotopaxi slipped out in one vast convulsion, and a tumult of lava poured out so high and broad and swift and liquid that in one day it reached the sea. So the star, with the one moon in its wake, marched across the Pacific, trailed the thunderstorms like the hem of a robe, and the growing tidal wave that toiled behind it, frothing and eager, poured over island and swept them clear of men, until that wave came at last in a blinding light, and with the breath of a furnace, swift and terrible it came, a wall of water 50 feet high, roaring hungrily upon the long coasts of Asia, and it swept inland across the plains of China. For a space the star, hotter now and larger and brighter than the sun in its strength, showed with pitiless brilliance the wide and populous country, towns and villages with their pagodas and trees, roads, wide cultivated fields, millions of sleepless people staring in helpless terror at the incandescent sky. And then low and growing came the murmur of the flood, and thus it was that with millions of men that night, a flight no whither, with their limbs heavy with the heat, and breath fierce and scant, and the flood like a wall swift and white behind. And then death. China was lit glowing white, but over Japan and Java and all the islands of Eastern Asia, the great star was a ball of dull red fire, because of the steam and smoke and ashes the volcanoes were spouting forth to salute its coming. Above was the lava, hot gases and ash, and below the seething floods, and the whole earth swayed and rumbled with earthquake shocks. Soon the immemorial snows of Tibet and the Himalayas were melting and pouring down by 10 million deepening converging channels upon the plains of Burma and Hindustan. The tangled summits of the Indian jungles were aflame in 1,000 places, and below the hurrying waters around the stems, a dark object still struggled feebly and reflected the blood-red tongues of fire. And in a rudderless confusion a multitude of men and women fled down the broad riverways to that one last hope of men, the open sea. Larger grew the star, and larger, hotter, and brighter, with a terrible swiftness now. The tropical ocean had lost its phosphorescence, and the whirling steam rose in ghostly wreaths from the black waves that plunged incessantly, speckled with storm-tossed ships. And then came a wonder. It seemed to those who in Europe watched for the rising of the star that the world must have ceased its rotation. In 1,000 open spaces of down and upland, the people who had fled thither from the floods and the falling houses and sliding slopes of hill watched for that rising in vain. Hour followed hour through the terrible suspense, and the star rose not. Once again men set their eyes upon the old constellations that counted lost to them forever. In England it was hot and clear overhead, though the ground quivered perpetually, but in the tropics Sirius and Capella and Aldebaran showed through a veil of steam. And when at last the great star rose near 10 hours late, the sun rose close upon it, and in the center of its white heart was a disk of black. Over Asia it was the star had begun to fall behind the movements of the sky, and then suddenly, as it hung over India, its light had been veiled. All the plain of India, from the mouth of the Indus to the mouth of the Ganges, was a shallow waste of shining water that night, out of which rose temples and palaces, mounds and hills, black with people. Every minaret was a clustering mass of people who fell one by one into the turbid waters, as heat and terror overcame them. The whole land seemed a wailing, and suddenly there swept a shadow across that furnace of despair, and a breath of cold wind and a gathering of clouds out of the cooling air. Men looked up near blinded at the star, saw that a black disk was creeping across the light. It was the moon coming between the star and the earth, and even as men cried to God at this respite, out of the east with a strange inexplicable swiftness sprang the sun, and then star and sun and moon rushed together across the heavens. So it was presently to the European watchers, star and sun rose close upon each other, drove headlong for a space and then slower and at last came to rest. Star and sun merged into one glare of flame at the zenith of the sky. The moon no longer eclipsed the star but was lost to sight in the brilliance of the sky, and though those who were still alive regarded it for the most part with that dull stupidity that hunger, fatigue, heat, and despair engender, there were still men who could perceive the meaning of these signs. Star and earth had been at their nearest, had swung about one another, and the star had passed. Already it was receding, swifter and swifter in the last stage of its headlong journey towards the sun. And then the clouds gathered, blotting out the vision of the sky. The thunder and lightning wove a garment around the world. All over the earth was a downpour of rain such as men had never before seen, and where the volcanoes flared red against the cloud canopy, there descended torrents of mud. Everywhere the waters were pouring off the land, leaving mud-stilted ruins and the earth littered like a storm-worn beach, with all that it floated, and the bodies of the men and brutes, its children. For days the water streamed off the land, sweeping away soil and trees and houses in the way, and piling large dikes and scooping out titanic gullies over the countryside. Those were the days of darkness that followed the star and heat. All through them, and for many weeks and months, the earthquakes continued. But the star had passed, and men, hunger-driven and gathering courage only slowly, might creep back to their ruined cities, buried granaries, and sodden fields. Such few ships as had escaped the storms of that time came stunned and shattered and sounding their way cautiously through the new marks and shoals of once familiar ports. And as the storm subsided, men perceived that everywhere the days were hotter than of yore, and the sun larger, and the moon shrunk to a third of its former size. Now it took 80 days between its new and new. But of the new brotherhood that grew presently among men, the saving of laws and books and machines, of the strange change that had come over Iceland and Greenland and the shores of Baffin's Bay, so that sailors coming there presently found them green and gracious and could scarcely believe their eyes, the story does not tell. Nor of the movement of mankind now that the earth was hotter northward and southward towards the poles of the earth. It concerns itself only with the coming and the passing of the star. The Martian astronomers, for there are astronomers on Mars, although they are very different beings from men, were naturally profoundly interested by these things. They saw them from their own standpoint, of course. Considering the mass and temperature of the missile that was flung through our solar system into the sun, one wrote, "It is astonishing what little damage the Earth, which had missed so narrowly, has sustained. All the familiar continental markings and the masses of the seas remain intact, and indeed the only difference seems to be a shrinkage of the white discoloration, supposed to be frozen water, round either pole, which only shows how small the vastness of human catastrophes may seem, at a distance of a few million miles." Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytime Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Undesir by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website and their Patreon, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.